Marion Coates never believed in miracles until the night she couldn't move her own legs, and a dog who couldn't see saved her life. The truck had gone off the logging road just after 9, sliding on wet gravel before it dropped 15 feet into a ravine choked with kudzu and pine. She remembered the silence after the crash more than the crash itself. The tick of a cooling engine, the hiss of steam under the hood, her own ragged breath filling the dark cab. Her left leg was pinned beneath the crumpled dash. Her phone had flown somewhere into the black, and no amount of stretching her fingers across the cold floorboard could find it. She was 68 years old, alone on a road nobody used after dark, and she understood, with a clarity sharper than the pain, that nobody was coming unless someone made them come. She screamed until her throat gave out. Above her, through the shattered window, stars scattered across a black Tennessee sky. Indifferent to her fear, she thought of Duke, her old coonhound, blind for a year and a half now, asleep back at the house 2 miles off, and she wondered, foolishly, desperately, if a dog who couldn't see could somehow still find his way to her in the dark. Have you ever wondered what your own animal would do if you needed them most, really needed them? With no one else around to hear you calling. The cold came first, before the fear really settled in. It crept up through the floorboard and into her hip, mixing with the pain until she couldn't tell any more where one ended and the other began. She tried moving her leg again and regretted it instantly, a white flash of pain rolling through her body so hard it stole the breath right out of her. She lay still after that, forcing herself to breathe slow, the way her husband used to tell her to breathe when the panic came, back when he was still alive, to say things like that. 6 years now since she'd buried him. 6 years of learning how to be a person alone in a house built for 2 people. A house that still had his reading glasses sitting in the drawer by the bed because she couldn't bring herself to move them. She thought of her sons, both grown, both states away, wrapped up in their own families and their own busy lives, neither one expecting a call from her until the weekend at the earliest. Nobody would notice she was missing for at least a day, maybe 2. The thought settled over her heavier than the cold ever could. She'd always thought of herself as a strong woman, self-sufficient, the kind who didn't ask for help unless she truly needed it. And now here she was, needing it more than she'd ever needed anything in her whole life, with absolutely no way on earth left to ask for it. She drifted in and out for a while after that. That strange half-sleep the body forces on a person when it's trying to protect itself from more pain than it can process. Each time she surfaced, she called out again, though her voice had worn down to little more than a rasp scraping the back of her throat. Somewhere around midnight, she stopped bargaining with the dark and started praying instead. The plain, stripped down kind of praying that comes out of a person who has absolutely nothing left to offer. Just a raw and desperate ask into the silence. Please, she thought, let someone find me before morning. And in that prayer, without quite meaning to, she found herself picturing Duke's face, the milky, clouded eyes that used to be sharp and amber before the disease took them. And she felt a strange, twisted comfort in believing that at least he was safe and warm and sleeping, spared from ever having to see her lying broken like this. She had no way of knowing that a mile and a half away, a 9-year-old blind hound had already lifted his head off the porch boards, already sensed something wrong stirring in the night air, and had already begun the long, impossible walk that would change both of their lives forever. Duke had come into Marion's life 9 years earlier, a lanky black and tan coonhound with a bay that could rattle the windows and ears so soft they felt like velvet against her palm. Her husband, Earl, had picked him out at the county shelter 3 months before the cancer took him. And looking back now, Marion sometimes wondered if some quiet part of Earl had known she'd need something steady to hold on to once he was gone. Duke had been there through the funeral, sitting pressed against her black dress in the front pew of a church that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. He'd been there through the unbearable stillness of the house afterward, through the first Christmas she spent without setting a second plate at the table, through every long winter evening when the silence pressed in on her like weather. He slept every single night pressed against her legs, a warm, solid weight in the dark that told her, without a single word needed, that she wasn't entirely alone in that house. Every morning, rain or shine, he walked her down to the mailbox like it was some sacred appointment neither of them would dream of missing, tail high, nose working the cool morning air, announcing to the whole holler that Marion Coates was up and the day could officially begin. 18 months before the accident, the vet had delivered news that broke something in Marion all over again. Glaucoma advanced, untreatable, the pressure in Duke's eyes already too high to save what sight remained. Within 4 months, his whole world had gone completely dark. Marion remembered crying the entire drive home from that appointment, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white, asking nobody in particular why God kept taking things away from her one piece at a time, as if her grief had a quota it hadn't yet met. Duke sat calm beside her the whole ride, nose working the air through the cracked window, like he could still read the whole world just fine without his eyes to help him along. And in a strange way, he could. Within weeks he was moving through the house without a single stumble, counting his careful steps from the porch to the water bowl, from the bedroom to the back door, relearning his entire world one patient pace at a time. Marion watched him do it without a hint of complaint, without any of the self-pity she privately felt entitled to on his behalf. And something about that quiet, uncomplaining patience taught her more about grace than any sermon she'd sat through in years. He never once ran into a wall. He never once seemed to mourn what he'd lost. He simply adjusted, the way animals so often do, trusting some deeper sense to carry him where his eyes no longer could. Neighbors who dropped by after the diagnosis sometimes asked Marion if she'd thought about finding Duke an easier home, somewhere flat and small where a blind dog wouldn't have so many stairs and so much yard to memorize. She always gave them the same answer, quiet but firm, that Duke wasn't going anywhere, that the two of them had already lost enough people and enough years to know that quitting on each other simply wasn't an option worth considering. She'd watched him relearn an entire farmhouse, the way a person relearns walking after an injury, patient and stubborn and utterly unwilling to be pitied. And somewhere in all that watching, she'd stopped seeing him as broken at all. They built a rhythm together after that, the two of them, out there at the end of the gravel road, where the nearest neighbor was better than a mile off. Marion talked to him constantly, out of habit and loneliness both, narrating her whole day like he was the only one left who still cared to listen. What she was cooking, what was on the television, what she remembered about Earl that particular morning, the small ordinary things a person needs to say out loud just to feel like the day counted for something. Duke answered in his own way. The thump of his tail against the floor, a low satisfied groan when she scratched behind his ears just right, a cold nose pressed into her palm whenever her silences stretched a little too long, as if he understood exactly when quiet had turned into something sadder than quiet. When her arthritis flared up bad and her mornings got slow and stiff, he waited by the door without a hint of impatience, matching his pace to hers instead of the other way around. Content to take twice as long getting anywhere, as long as they got there, together. It wasn't a dramatic kind of love, what the two of them shared. It was steadier than that, quieter than that. It was two creatures who'd each lost something essential. She her husband, he his sight, learning, day by day, meal by meal, quiet evening by quiet evening, to be enough for one another. She kept his water bowl in the exact same spot it had always been, never moved so much as an inch, because she understood by then that his whole world depended on things staying where he expected them to be. She learned to announce herself before she touched him, a soft word before her hand ever found his fur, so she'd never once startle him in the dark. And he, in turn, learned the particular rhythm of her footsteps so well he could tell, just from the sound of her walking across the kitchen, whether she was having a good day or a hard one. On the hard days, he stayed closer. On the good days, he still stayed close, just a little more relaxed about it, tail loose and easy against the floor. Small things, most people would say. But small things, stacked up over 9 years, were the whole architecture of what they had. Some evenings, when the loneliness sat heavier than usual, Marion would sit out on the porch steps long after the sun went down, just to feel the cool air, and remember what it used to feel like having someone else's voice fill up the house. Duke would settle beside her every time, his weight warm against her hip, and she'd talk to him about anything at all. Earl's old truck rusting out behind the barn, the garden she didn't have the energy to plant anymore, whether her boys would ever bring the grandkids down for more than a holiday weekend. He never once looked away from her while she talked, blind eyes turned toward her voice the same way sighted eyes turn toward a face. And something about that steady attention made her feel less like she was talking to herself and more like she was simply being heard. She'd never admit it to her sons, worried they'd think their mother had gone soft in the head, but there were nights she was certain Duke understood more of what she said than most of the people who'd ever sat across from her at that same kitchen table. The night everything changed had started as nothing at all. Marion had only meant to drive out and check on her late sister's cabin, 2 miles down that old logging road nobody had used since her sister passed the year before. She hadn't told a soul she was going. Why would she? It was a 15-minute errand, the kind she'd made 100 times without a second thought, just to make sure a window hadn't blown open or a pipe hadn't burst in the summer heat. Duke had been asleep on the porch when she left, worn out from the day's warmth, and she hadn't thought twice about leaving him there. It was supposed to be nothing, just a quick drive out and a quick drive back, home again before the 10 o'clock news. The road, though, was worse than she remembered, chewed rough by log trucks and softened by a week of rain nobody had bothered to warn her about. She took the curve a little too fast, the way she'd taken that same curve 100 times before without incident, but the tires found no grip this time, sliding loose across gravel gone slick as glass. By the time her mind caught up with what was happening, the truck was already sliding sideways toward the tree line, and there was nothing left to do but grip the wheel and brace. Metal folded, glass sprayed across the cab like ice. The whole world tipped sideways, rolled and dropped, before it finally came to rest at the bottom of that ravine, nose down in the brush, engine ticking in the sudden and terrible quiet. She came to slowly, minutes or maybe longer after the impact, her left leg wedged hard beneath the crumpled dash, throbbing in a way that told her, even before the full pain arrived, that something inside her was badly, seriously wrong. Every attempt to shift her weight sent fresh pain shooting up through her hip, sharp enough to steal the breath clean out of her lungs. She screamed until her throat gave out entirely, and then she simply lay there, listening to the woods breathe around her. Crickets, an owl calling somewhere far off in the dark, the distant, indifferent rumble of a logging truck on a road she had absolutely no way to reach. The hours crawled by like that, her body shivering harder as the night air cooled around her, her mind drifting toward the kind of thoughts she didn't want to think but couldn't quite stop thinking either, about how easily a person could simply disappear out here, swallowed whole by trees and silence, and how many days it might take before anyone even thought to start looking. She tried the door first, pushing against it with what strength she had left, but the frame had buckled in the crash, and it wouldn't budge more than an inch. She tried the window next, the one still mostly intact, straining her arm up through the gap to wave at a road that had no one on it to see her waving. Her fingers searched the dark floorboard over and over for that phone, patting blind through broken glass and spilled coffee from the cup she'd carried out of habit, cutting her palm twice on shards she couldn't see. Each failed attempt cost her something, some fraction of the hope she'd started with, until she understood there was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting was its own kind of unbearable. She thought about honking the horn, but the crash had killed that too, along with the headlights, along with anything that might have signaled to the world that a woman was down here, alive and running out of time. The dark pressed in closer with every passing hour, and somewhere around 11 she stopped believing anyone would find her before daylight, if they found her at all. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that a mile and a half away, Duke had already stirred awake on that porch, some old instinct pulling him upright before his mind had even caught up to what his body already sensed. Marion's scent should have simply been there on the evening air, the same familiar trail she left every single time she walked out to the truck. But instead of returning the way it always did, it was fading, thinning out into nothing, and something in that absence unsettled him in a way he had no words to explain, only a growing wrongness he couldn't ignore no matter how he tried. He paced the length of the porch twice, nails clicking soft against the boards, and whined low at the door leading into a house that had gone completely silent. No footsteps, no voice, none of the small sounds that told him the woman he loved was somewhere close and safe. Marion, meanwhile, had reached the place most people only reach in situations exactly like hers. That strange, terrible calm that settles in only after fear has burned itself completely and utterly out. Her voice was gone by then, worn down to nothing but a whisper. Her leg had shifted from screaming pain into a dull, distant ache that frightened her far more than the pain ever had, because some part of her, some old and practical part, understood exactly what that kind of numbness could mean for a body left too long out in the cold. She thought about her sons again, wondered what they'd feel if this was really it, wondered if they'd forgive themselves for not calling more often, the way children always do after it's too late to matter. She thought about Earl, and for the first time in 6 years, she found herself almost hoping there really was something waiting on the other side, if only so she wouldn't have to be quite so alone in whatever came next. The cold had worked its way fully into her bones by then, and her thoughts had started to blur soft at the edges in a way she recognized, distantly, as dangerous. Somewhere around midnight, she stopped bargaining and started praying instead. Not the practiced kind she recited in church every Sunday, but the raw, stripped-down kind that only comes from a person with absolutely nothing left to bargain with. She asked God, if he was listening at all out there past those cold stars, to at least let someone find her before the sun came up. She thought of Duke again, pictured him safe and sleeping, curled up on the porch where she'd left him, and found herself grateful. In that strange and twisted way exhausted people manage to be grateful for small mercies. That at least her old dog wouldn't ever have to see her lying broken like this. Wouldn't have to carry that picture of her the rest of his life. It was, she thought, the one small kindness the whole miserable night had left her. She let her eyes close then, not sleeping exactly, just resting against the weight of everything her body had carried for hours without complaint. Somewhere in that half-conscious drift, she found herself remembering the day she'd brought Duke home as a puppy, how Earl had knelt down on the kitchen floor and let the little hound climb straight into his lap, how he'd laughed and said the dog had already decided this was his family, and there wasn't much use arguing with him about it. She hadn't thought about that memory in years, and it surprised her how clearly it came back now, in the cold, in the dark, in a moment that felt like it might be the last quiet thing her mind ever handed her. She wondered if this was simply how it happened for people, not with some dramatic final thought, but with small, ordinary memories rising up gentle at the very end, as if the mind wanted to leave on something kind. Duke did not lie back down. He stood there on that porch a long while, head lifted, nostrils working the night air the way he'd worked it 1,000 times before, searching for the one thread of scent that made sense of his entire world. It wasn't there, not the way it should have been, and something in that absence pulled at him harder than sleep, harder than the comfort of a familiar porch board beneath his paws. A dog with sight might have simply waited by the door, trusting the world to right itself eventually. A dog who had spent 18 months learning that waiting solved nothing, that only moving forward ever brought him closer to what he needed, did something else entirely. He stepped off that porch, down the 2 wooden steps he knew by heart, and out into a yard that suddenly felt far larger and far more uncertain than it had in daylight. It should not have worked. Every rational person Marion ever told this story to said the same thing afterward. A blind dog, tracking a truck's fading exhaust and a woman's thinning scent through 1.5 miles of dense Tennessee forest, in pitch dark, with no one there to guide him, shouldn't have had any real chance of succeeding. The odds were impossible on paper, and any reasonable person would have called it foolish to even try. But Duke had spent 18 months learning to trust his nose over the eyes that had failed him, learning patiently, painfully, that the world could still be read clearly enough if a creature paid close enough attention to what little was left. That night, every hard 1 hour of that patience paid off in a way nobody watching could have predicted. He moved slow at first, nose low to the ground, correcting his path every time the scent thinned to nearly nothing, stopping dead still more than once to lift his head and test the wind for some fresher trace of her. He crossed the gravel drive, found the tire ruts leading toward the logging road, and followed them the way he'd followed 100 smaller trails around the property, one careful pace at a time. The going got harder once he left the open yard behind. Briars caught at his ears and pulled, drawing thin lines of blood he didn't stop to notice. He stumbled twice over roots hidden in the leaf litter, catching himself before he fell, shaking off the jolt and pressing forward without ever once turning back toward home. Near a shallow creek bed, the scent nearly vanished altogether, washed thin by water and time, and for a long, terrible stretch Duke circled the same 20 feet of muddy bank, nose down, searching for a thread that seemed to have disappeared entirely. Any dog with less reason to keep going might have given up right there, turned around, and made the long walk back to the safety of a familiar porch. Duke did not turn around. He worked the bank in widening circles until he caught the faintest trace again, further down along the water, and pushed on into deeper woods where the pine needles muffled every sound and the dark pressed close on every side. He was tired by then, his old joints aching from the uneven ground, his breath coming ragged through a chest that had worked harder that night than it had worked in years. But something kept pulling him forward, something stronger than fatigue, stronger than fear of the unfamiliar terrain closing in around him. The same something that had gotten him off that porch in the first place, refusing, with everything in him, to let him stop. Somewhere past the halfway point, he lost the trail a second time, this stretch of woods thicker than anything he'd crossed before, the ground rising steep and uneven beneath his paws. He stood still for a long moment, sides heaving, head swinging slow from side to side as he tested every direction the wind might carry something familiar to him. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing came. And then, faint as a whisper, he caught it again. Not the scent of the truck this time, but something older and more human, the particular smell that belonged only to Marion, carried down off the ridge on a shift in the night air. He turned toward it without hesitation, climbing where the ground demanded climbing, pushing through a stand of laurel that scraped hard against his flank, moving now with a kind of urgency that hadn't been there before, as if some part of him understood he was finally close. It was close to 1 in the morning when Marion heard it. A sound so faint, at first she was certain her own mind had simply invented it out of pure desperation, the way exhausted minds sometimes conjure exactly what they're desperate to hear. A bark, distant, but unmistakably familiar in a way that reached past the fog of pain and cold, and straight into something older in her, some part of her that recognized that particular voice before her conscious mind had even caught up to the sound of it. She held what was left of her breath and listened hard, and it came again, closer this time, closer still a moment after that. She began crying before she'd even let herself fully believe it was real, tears cutting warm tracks down a face gone numb from the cold, some deep and ancient part of her simply knowing, the way a mother knows a child's cry in a crowded room, that Duke was out there and Duke was coming. 10 minutes later, she heard him crashing through the underbrush somewhere above the ravine, branches snapping, loose stones sliding, and then his voice was right there, right above her, frantic and certain all at once, cutting through the dark like nothing she'd ever heard from him in 9 years together. She called his name with everything her ruined voice had left to give, and his bark changed instantly, sharpened into something wilder and more urgent, a sound that told her he'd heard her too, that he knew exactly where she was now, down in that ravine he had no way of seeing, but understood completely just the same. Duke couldn't get down into the ravine himself. The drop was too steep, the footing too loose and treacherous for a dog with no eyes left to trust his own feet on it, and some old instinct for self-preservation kept him from simply throwing himself down blind into the dark. But he didn't leave her, not for 1 second, not even to search for an easier way down. He planted himself hard at the edge of that gravel road, right above where she lay pinned in the wreckage, and he barked. He barked in a way that carried for miles down that empty stretch of road, relentless, refusing to stop even as his voice began to fray and crack from the sheer effort of it. Hour bleeding into hour with no sign that anyone at all was coming to answer him. Marion lay below him listening to that sound, drawing strength from it the way a drowning person draws strength from the sight of shore. And for the first time since the crash, she let herself believe, really believe, that she might actually live to see morning. It took nearly 40 minutes for that barking to reach anyone at all. Wade Pruitt, a log truck driver who'd hauled that same road for 11 years running, was making an early run before sunrise when his headlights swept across something standing dead center in the road ahead of him. A lone hound, planted firm, refusing every blast of his horn and every flash of his high beams to move so much as an inch. He braked hard, half expecting the dog to bolt once the truck got close. But Duke held his ground, barking straight at him with an intensity that stopped Wade cold before he'd even climbed down from the cab. Something about the way that dog stood there, unmoving, insistent, told Wade this wasn't an animal simply lost or spooked. This was an animal trying to tell him something, and 11 years of driving that lonely stretch of road had taught Wade to trust his gut when it told him to pay attention. He grabbed the flashlight from under his seat and followed Duke to the edge of the ravine, where the dog stopped, turned his blind eyes down toward the dark below, and barked one final time, as if to say, "Right here, she's right here." Wade climbed down that embankment with nothing but a flashlight and his own 2 hands, sliding half the way on loose gravel and roots, calling out into the dark until Marion's weak voice finally answered him back. He found her exactly where Duke's barking had pointed him, pinned and shivering, barely conscious, 4.5 hours after the crash first threw her into that ditch. He said afterward that the first thing she'd asked him, through cracked lips and a voice worn down to almost nothing, wasn't about herself at all. It was whether somebody could please go check on her dog, make sure he made it home safe from wherever he'd wandered off to. Wade radioed for help right there on the spot, staying with her, talking to her, keeping her awake the way the operator on the line instructed him to, while somewhere above them Duke paced the edge of the road, unwilling to leave even after help had finally arrived. The paramedics told her later, once she was stable enough to understand what they were saying, that another 2 or 3 hours out there in the cold, given the internal bleeding they eventually found in her hip, might well have been more than her body could survive. She didn't need the exact numbers to know the truth sitting underneath them. She'd felt her own life narrowing that night, felt the edges of everything going soft and dark at the corners, the same way Duke's own vision must have gone dark all those months before, and she believes now, without one shred of doubt left in her, that a blind dog's nose was the only thing standing between her and a ditch nobody would have thought to search until it was already far too late. They loaded her into the ambulance as the sky was just beginning to gray at the edges, and Marion remembered, through the haze of shock and pain medication, twisting her head to look back one last time for Duke, catching sight of him standing at the top of that ravine, ears low, tail tucked, watching the whole scene unfold with an expression she swore, even in that state, looked exactly like worry. Wade promised her right then that he'd see the dog got home safe, and something in his voice, steady and certain, let Marion finally close her eyes and let the ambulance carry her the rest of the way toward help. She would learn later that Wade kept that promise to the letter, driving Duke home himself once the paramedics had Marion secured, refusing to leave until he'd seen the old hound settled safe inside the house he'd fought so hard to lead them back to. The surgeons who worked on Marion's hip that morning told her afterward, in the flat, clinical way doctors sometimes deliver the biggest truths of a person's life, that the internal bleeding had been serious enough that timing had mattered more than almost anything else in her recovery. Another few hours, and the outcome might have looked very different. She lay in that hospital bed, turning that fact over and over in her mind, and every time she turned it, she landed in the same place, that a 9-year-old dog with no working eyes had done what search parties, well, meaning neighbors, and simple luck had failed to do, because none of those things even knew to go looking yet. It wasn't luck that found her. It was a decision, made in the dark, by an animal who could have simply stayed safe and warm on that porch and let the night take its course. He hadn't. That single fact settled into Marion somewhere deep, somewhere past logic, and she never once managed to shake it loose again. They brought Duke to the hospital 2 days later, against every rule the staff had on the books, because a young nurse named Dana had heard the whole story secondhand from Wade and quietly arranged it herself, badge be damned. Marion remembered the sound of his nails clicking against the tile floor, before she even saw him come through the door. Remembered him finding his way straight to her bed without a single hand there to guide him, as though her scent alone was a rope strung clean across the whole building for him to follow home. He rested his head on the blanket beside her hip, careful, like some part of him already understood exactly where not to press his weight, and let out one long breath that sounded, to everyone standing in that room, exactly like relief given a voice at last. Marion healed slow that year. A shattered hip takes its own sweet time in a body pushing 70, no matter how badly the mind wants to rush it along. But she never spent a single night of that long recovery without Duke pressed warm against her legs, patient the same way he'd always been patient, as if he understood, somewhere deep down, that healing was just another kind of darkness a body learns to walk through one careful step at a time. Physical therapy was hard, some days unbearably so, and there were mornings she didn't want to get out of bed at all, didn't see the point of pushing through pain that felt endless. On those mornings, Duke waited by the door anyway, the same way he always had, refusing to let her give up on the walk to the mailbox, even when the walk had become the hardest part of her day. She thinks about the strange grace of it often now, how the very same disease that had stolen her old dog's eyesight seemed, in the end, to have sharpened something else inside him instead, some deeper sense that had nothing at all to do with seeing and everything to do with love. She's stopped trying to explain it in scientific terms to the people who ask, stopped worrying whether it sounds foolish to say out loud. She just says it plainly now, to anyone willing to listen, that a blind dog smelled death coming for her that night, out there alone in the dark, and simply refused, with everything he had left in him, to let it win. Word of what Duke had done spread through the county faster than Marion ever expected. Wade told the story to anyone who'd listen at the truck stop, and the local paper picked it up not long after, running a small piece with a photograph of Marion sitting on her porch, Duke's head resting heavy in her lap. She got letters after that, from strangers mostly, people who'd lost someone or lost a pet, or simply needed to believe, that same week, that love like that was still possible in the world. She answered every single one she could manage, her handwriting shaky from the medication, because it felt important somehow that people know the truth of it, that it hadn't been anything magical or unexplainable, just an old dog who loved her enough to walk through the dark without any eyes to show him the way. She's 71 now, and Duke, gray around the muzzle and considerably slower these days, still sleeps pressed against her legs every single night, still counts out his careful steps to the water bowl the way he taught himself all those years back, still lifts his head every time she walks into a room, checking, out of some old and faithful habit, that she's really there. She says she doesn't need her own eyes anymore to know when somebody loves her either. She only needs to feel it, the way Duke taught her without ever meaning to teach her anything at all. In the weight of something warm and steady lying close beside her in the dark, refusing, night after night, to ever let her be alone again. So here's what Marion wants you sitting with tonight. If your own dog, your own cat, your own horse had to find you somewhere out in the pitch dark, with nothing in the world to guide them but love alone, do you believe, in your heart, that they would come? And what's the one moment your own animal showed up for you exactly when you needed them most, the one you still carry with you, still think about on the quiet nights? If stories like this one move something in you, if you believe, the way Marion believes, that the bond between a person and their animal is one of the purest, truest things this life has to offer, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we bring you a brand new story just like this one in every single video, and we'd truly love to have you here for the next one. Drop your answer down in the comments. Tell us about your own Duke, your own moment out there in the dark, and give this video a like if it touched your heart even half as much as it touched ours in the telling of it.